thank everybody for waiting as we have been sitting on the edge of our seats waiting on Congressman Massey to get done with a dinner engagement that he said he was previously committed to, but he wanted to make time to share with you all his thoughts on something of interest to all of us in the Common Core battle. I think everybody here, but if you're in the sound of my voice and you've ever wondered, can we abolish the Department of Education? You hear a lot of talk about that. But we have one congressman, Congressman Thomas Massey of the great state of Kentucky. And Congressman Massey, come over and have a seat right here in this chair. And he is joining us from Washington, D.C. behind his iPhone. And Congressman Massey, I can't begin to describe to you the zeal and joy that I experienced when I first read H.R. 899, because this is a constitutionalist dream. Yeah, it didn't take me long to read it, that's for sure. But honestly, Congressman, my first thought was, this could be like a publicity stunt, something that you can tell the folks back home to vote for you, but you're serious. You want to abolish the Department of Education.
Oh, absolutely, we're serious. This was a campaign promise of mine 4 years ago, and honestly, I should have done it sooner. But, it took a while to learn how to write the best bill. And
all 10 words.
Yes, all 10 words. And it's, the timing is important. I wouldn't lie to you and say that the timing was accidental, that I accidentally walked over to the chamber of the House of Representatives and put this bill in the hopper at the very moment they were voting on Betsy DeVos in the Senate. No, that was not an accident, and that's definitely has helped propel the visibility of this bill. But it's a very serious bill, and I'm on a very serious mission, and this is part of a campaign promise. What I realized was that now is the time for this bill, if there ever was a time. Because, when Obama was in office, I got 3, maybe 5 phone calls a day in my office, frankly, and 1 or 2 of them every day was to impeach Obama, but usually the same person. But now that Trump is in office, I'm getting 30 to 50 phone calls a day. And for a period of time, most of those phone calls were from people who wanted me to vote against Betsy DeVos. Now, first of all, the Department of Education failed them in teaching the Constitution. Yeah. Advise and consent of presidential nominees is vested in the Senate, not in the House. Mm-hmm. And I'm in the House of Representatives. So we had to tell them, no, I don't get to vote on Betsy DeVos. At which point they got very desperate and said, well, you're in Congress. Do anything you can to stop her from becoming the Secretary of the Department of Education. And it was at that point I realized, this is the time for my bill. This is the time to introduce it, because they told me to do anything I could to stop her. And what I did was introduce the bill that is, as you said, 10 words. It says the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2018. Very short, very sweet, to the point, and there's nothing to argue about. It will eliminate 4,500 jobs over at the Department of Education. It'll eliminate the entire department as well as the secretary's job. I don't know if you can hear that buzzer. That says that Congress is now going out of session. So
okay, you are released.
There's a buzzer in my office that notifies me of these things. It usually means that Louis Gohmert is done talking tonight.
Louis Gohmert never gets done talking, Congressman. He never.
Well, just for tonight. And, he goes over and he's very passionate and he speaks on the floor of the House quite frequently. And he's a fan of this bill, I can tell you. But anyways, this bill unambiguously eliminates 4,500 bureaucrats' jobs. By the way, each of them, on average, make $105,000 a year. That's over twice the average teacher salary in Kentucky.
I thought you were using that number as hyperbole when I first heard it, but you're telling me it's actually correct. And well, the bill's kind of open-ended, Congressman. We spoke earlier, and now the people that you're hearing from, are they your left-wing radicals, or is it your right-wing nut jobs, or a little bit of both, and everybody in the middle?
Well, I might resemble one of those remarks, but the people that I'm hearing from are actually on both sides. There are, of course, there have always been the people who realize that the Department of Education is unconstitutional,
Right.
and so they support the bill. But on the right, you have some people who are not comfortable with Betsy DeVos. But most of these complaints were coming from the left, who were unhappy with Betsy DeVos. So, we tell them now when they call that I've eliminated a bill, or I've introduced a bill to eliminate her position. And and most of them are pretty satisfied with that answer. But if they ask any further, we say, listen, do you think that Donald Trump, President Trump, and or his appointees should be deciding what or how your children learn? Because if you don't, then you should support this bill. And that's where we are with it. And it's there, when you and I spoke earlier, you asked, we talked a little bit about what would happen with the functions of the Department of Education. There have been longer bills introduced to eliminate the Department of Education that go into more specificity. But what I realized in reviewing some of those older bills is that not everybody agrees on what you should do with the functions that are now performed by the Department of Education. There are basically three categories of things you can do, and I'm going to save the best for last, which is the category that I most agree with. The first category of solutions involves taking programs and moving them to different departments. In other words, you wouldn't eliminate a single program. Pell Grants would go on, student loan program would go on, Individuals with Disabilities Act, Title I funding, all of that would continue, but you would transfer it to different departments. For instance, HHS already administers Head Start. The USDA already administers the school lunch program. So it's not inconceivable that you could take the student loan program and move it to the Treasury Department, or to take Individuals with Disabilities Act, which frankly is mostly decided in the courts, but you could move it in with Head Start over at HHS. That's the first category, is you just reassign responsibility for these programs to other departments. The second, more preferable solution for what you do with the functions that are now performed by the Department of Education is you take all of the money, every penny. In fact, you're going to have more money when you fire 4,500 bureaucrats. You take all of that money and you block grant it back to the states. And every state in the union has a Department of Education, perfectly capable of managing this money. And they would have more money if Washington, D.C. weren't spending parts of it.
Well, they're siphoning off a substantial amount in salary.
That's right, in salary and overhead, not to mention all the extra paperwork that consume our school systems back in the States. They would be freed up, and they would have more resources for that reason as well. So that's the second solution.
Now, there's a Department of Education in every state. So this isn't like a national sales tax that some states aren't even equipped to collect such a thing. Every state
Correct.
is capable of handling education on their own merit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every state already has this function. No state got rid of their Department of Education when the federal Department of Education came into existence. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. And by the way, every state also has school districts, which are even more capable of making decisions right down to the parent level. So that's the second option, is to block grant the programs instead of reassigning them to other federal administrative branches. The third option is basically to get the federal government out of education altogether. In fact, right now, only 10% of primary and secondary education funding goes through the federal government. I say goes through, I don't say comes from, because nothing comes from the federal government. There's nothing produced in Washington, D.C. It's basically money comes here and less money goes out. And in the process, skyscrapers are being built here for the lobbyists and bureaucrats to live in. So instead of running, in this third option, instead of running the money through D.C., you leave everything at the state level, including the responsibility for collecting any tax money that you would want to allocate to these various programs. And by the way, the third option is the constitutional option.
Right. Exactly. So, in that range of options, it's hard for me to imagine anybody, wherever they may be situated in the political spectrum, they should be comfortable with that. So where's the opposition going to come from?
It's interesting. The arguments that I hear are, most of them are false. For instance, people argue about Individuals with Disabilities Act that can't logically function without a Department of Education. And I point out that bill, that law passed before the Department of Education existed. So there are a lot of people complaining, and a lot of student loan programs passed before the Department of Education existed. They're complaining that these things can't exist in the absence of the Department of Education, but that's false because they already did exist and went just fine to the extent any federal program can. What are some of the other oppositions? They're downright condescending, some of the rebuttal. For instance, they will say that some states are too ignorant or can't be trusted to manage the education of their citizens. And I find that very offensive. By the way, I haven't found a teacher yet who says, please bring the federal government into my classroom and have them tell me what I must teach and how I must teach it. I haven't found a teacher yet that agrees with that. Now, sometimes, and most of the administrators would prefer more local control. But sometimes you find these liberals that believe that people are basically, it's remarkable. They think that people in any one given state are too ignorant to govern themselves, but somehow that all the geniuses have collected in Washington, D.C. And I can assure you that is not the case. The further away from Washington, D.C., the higher the IQ is.
Congressman Massey, if this were to happen, what would it take? I mean, everybody in this camp is solidly behind this. We want to pledge whatever support we can throw your way. What would you challenge us to do? What would you ask that we do? How can we help you make this happen for us?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. The next step in pushing this bill forward is to get a hearing. Okay, and I am not on the Education and Workforce Committee, but I do serve on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. In fact, 4 of the 7 co-sponsors, or actually there's 8 counting myself, half of the sponsors of this bill are on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. That's the committee that's chaired by Jason Chaffetz, and it has broad jurisdiction. It can go into any aspect of government and look for waste, fraud, and abuse. Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows, for instance, are subcommittee chairman on that committee. We would love to get a hearing, and we can do this in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. But to get that hearing, we're going to need more co-sponsors and more support. So I know I'm talking to people all over the country. I know your webcast goes everywhere. And if you're not in one of the 8 congressional districts whose congressman already sponsors this bill, it would be great if you could recommend to your congressman to take a look at this bill and be polite and ask them to consider sponsoring it.
And that would be H.R. 899.
That's correct, H.R. 899.
So at this point, your request, your advice, your counsel to us, all of us, would be to just pick up the phone, call your, we don't need to call the entire, United States Congress, but call the representative that represents the district we're in and politely ask them to take a look at H.R. 899 to abolish the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education. And that's the next step.
That's correct. At my town halls, I give advice for communicating with your congressmen and senators. The first thing I would say is don't waste your time writing a letter. You can do that after you've made the phone call, but frankly, the phone call is the most effective way to connect with a congressman's office. Because
since 9/11, it's almost impossible to get paper to your office.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you send a letter, it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks because it gets scanned for anthrax, and the postal system here in the House is not that efficient. But also, letters don't require an immediate response. When you make a phone call here, each congressman only has a staff of at most 16 people. And a lot of those are doing other things. So a phone call gets a lot of attention here in Washington, D.C. But the other advice I give is, if it's not your congressman, don't call him,
right.
Or your senator. So at most, anybody listening to this, at most, needs to make 3 phone calls, because you've got 2 senators and a congressman.
Now, is there a companion bill in the Senate?
There's not a companion bill yet, and I'm not sure if there's a similar bill. I'll have to look into that. So that's a good question.
So we can focus on the U.S. representatives for now.
Yeah,
and if you're not a constituent, don't call that rep, to badger them.
Don't badger them, don't bother them. And when you do talk to your own rep, whether they're liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, be polite. Always be polite. Our staff is underpaid, and they work long hours. And you get nowhere by badgering them. Just be polite and don't take much time. Get off the phone.
Right.
They'll be more happy to take your call if you're brief and to the point.
Congressman, you're speaking to a lot of political activists that have made calls, and how would you address the notion or the sense or the feeling that some of us may have that it just doesn't make any difference that we call?
Oh, it makes a heck of a difference. I make this point over and over in my town halls. I probably shouldn't, because I end up getting more phone calls as a result. But I should do it in other congressional districts, I suppose. Let me tell you, I've been on the floor of the House, and you may think we've got our mind made up when we go to vote. But in fact, I've been on the floor of the House, and at any given time, particularly on difficult bills, you'll see dozens of people trying to decide right there. And there's a timer counting down, like from 5 minutes down to 0, and they're still trying to decide. And I've had members come up to me and say, how many calls did you get for this? How many calls did you get against it? And people will actually talk right there on the floor of the House about how many calls they got for and against it. And of course, they're only counting the calls that come from their actual constituents. But it makes a big difference, I think. And for instance, just as an example, in 2013, and I know this is off of this subject, but in 2013, Obama said that Assad crossed a red line and that he wanted to go to war in Syria, if you remember that. We got 100 phone calls a day for 7 days in a row, and 99-1, they were telling me, don't put boots on the ground in Syria. And you got to remember, ISIS did not exist. In fact, Obama's idea was to ally ourselves with the so-called, moderate rebels. Anyways, you know what? That never came to a vote. And the reason it never came to a vote is constituents melted the phone lines here, and it was so unpopular that nobody wanted to vote on it, so they didn't even put it on the floor. And it works the other way around as well. I'm a sponsor of a bill called Audit the Fed, which has passed the House twice, I believe. It passed. I got it through committee last year, and we'll move it through the Oversight Committee here pretty soon this year. It's had over 200 co-sponsors in the past, and the only way you get that kind of co-sponsorship, I'd like to think I'm persuasive to my colleagues, but I can talk to them till I'm blue in the face, and I can even convince them I'm right, and they still won't co-sponsor my bill. But if they get 10 calls or 100 calls asking them to co-sponsor Audit the Fed or the bill to eliminate the Department of Education, they take it very seriously.
Congressman Massey, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time tonight, and we're just very honored that you would take your time to share, with this group of patriots. We're solidly behind you, and again, we pledge our support to you. We thank you for bringing this bill in the first place, and we just wish you Godspeed and the best of luck, and our prayers are with you, and please call upon us if you need any help.
Thank you very much. Thanks for covering this and getting the word out. Everybody listen to this. Talk to your neighbors. Tell them about this bill. It doesn't matter if they're liberal or conservative. Conservatives are going to agree that this shouldn't be a federal issue, and liberals are going to agree they don't want Betsy DeVos teaching their kids or telling their teachers what to teach them. So it doesn't even matter. Maybe it's somebody you don't agree with on politics. See if you can get them to support this bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Massey.